We had to start with Batman Arkham Knight on the Nintendo Switch. It was the one that back in the day I bought a new graphics card for, and it managed to completely fry my computer. I just couldn't run it for whatever reason. So I was very intrigued to see how it would run on the Nintendo Switch and whether my fears were justified. We'll go over the frame rates, the visuals, performance, how it plays in docked and handheld modes, all of the game modes that you've got on the Nintendo Switch version, and it'll all be time-stamped down the bottom of the screen as well, so you can get to the bit you want. Alright, if you enjoy the content or it's useful, please do hit the like button. Stick around if you want, because we'll have the other two games visited either together or in separate videos, so you'll have 3 in total. Batman Arkham Knight on Nintendo Switch. Is it a good night? Well, let's find out. It's worth prefacing this review with a few thoughts. Now obviously we've recently had Mortal Kombat and we've had Harry Potter, both of which have come from Warner Brothers, but both which have been received very differently. Now all 3 of these games are running on the Unreal Engine, and I think Harry Potter was generally accepted as quite impressive because the game's very new, and a bit like The Witcher, no one expected them to get it working at all, so the compromises that were made were kind of understandable. While Arkham Knight doesn't quite have that same thing to fall back on, compared to the other 2 games it was the one that definitely required the more processing power. Install size, well, it's 27.2 gigs, and that will be the actual size once everything's unpacked onto your Nintendo Switch console just for this one game. It will have a separate icon from the others, a bit like we saw with the Metal Gear Solid games. As far as content, well, it's the base game, all of the DLCs they released, the AR challenges, which are a set of different objectives and locations to battle Penguin's minions to try and get the highest score, unlock new items, gear, etc, etc. Or there's the episode section where you can play as different characters such as Batwoman, Robin, Harley Quinn. So there's quite a bit of content here to sink your teeth into. As far as game options go, well, you've got the usual. You can invert the X and Y axis. Yes, you can do that separately. You can also invert flight controls, which I know is going to please some people, some weird people who don't like it up, down, down is up. You've got the option to toggle on and off camera assist, the hint system, and sensitivities. Nothing particularly out of the ordinary, but no, there is no gyro aiming for any of the tools that Batman has in his arsenal. It's almost a one-for-one replica of the controls we saw back in the day. What they have added in is some HD rumble though, and it's actually quite nice. It gives a little nuance to some of the combat, and I know it doesn't mean a lot to a lot of people, but I think it's quite an underrated feature when it's used well. Load times. This is an area I was very keen to see, and they're not terrible actually. When you die in game, the reload takes around 10 to 15 seconds, which doesn't feel long at all. Initial load times of the base game actually does take quite a while to get into the menus, but still nothing really to write home about, not really a huge issue, which takes us on to the meat. And when I say meat, I mean the image quality. Now, as far as resolution goes, we are not nearly at native. I'd say there's a high likelihood that they're using some form of upscaling technology, whether it be FSR2 or similar, but the in-game resolution clearly has taken a very big hit, and it shows itself in a number of areas that we'll go over. The level of detail draw distance takes a significant hit. Items in the distance, anything really that's further than a few meters in front of you, it's going to look quite washed out and blurry. A very good way of demonstrating this is if you go to the highest point on the map or just to the top of a building and look down at street level. Distant character models are still there. You can actually see some thugs moving around and even some cars, but the textures beneath them, there's a massive hit there. Now, before we really get into the open areas, we can see from the very first scenes where you play as a police officer, the difference in image quality between this and another version. Now, I know it upsets some people that I compare side by side with much more powerful hardware, so the best port of comparison is probably the PS4 version of the game. Aside from textures, which we'll talk about in a minute, aliasing is a big issue in Arkham Knight. Because of that much lower resolution and the amount of straight and diagonal lines that you have just within the city, aliasing shows up a lot here. There's staggered edges on almost every surface. It can feel really quite rough at times. Now, I do wonder if they chose to either leave out or reduce the amount of post-processed anti-aliasing to try and maintain some image quality, as we know that can add in quite a bit of blur to the world. With that said though, there are certain things like the textures which look downright bad in some locations. Look at the base of this pillar. The texture is so low res you can barely make out that there's a texture on it at all. Arkham Knight on Switch does feel a bit like a painting in that sometimes when you squint they almost look like photographs, and then you open your eyes and you can see where the issues lie. Now with that said, for me always the most important aspect is the performance. But before we go there, look at the handheld gameplay. It still has the same issues that we've mentioned, but mainly due to the fact that Arkham Knight is such a dark game and many of those lighting effects are still intact. I even noticed some reflections from car lights on the ground. When it's running okay, it's passable in handheld. Now that first area is actually quite telling. When you're playing as the policeman, the frame rate drops down to 27 FPS and then it fluctuates 27 to 30 and back down again. But the pacing doesn't feel too bad in these moments. The frames are actually delivered at quite a good rate towards the screen and quite consistently. But I was almost positive that it was when we went outdoors and we had to transition from the streets to the tops of buildings and back that we'd see the issues, and that's exactly what we've got. You'll see stutters, sometimes pauses, as the Switch desperately tries to load in what it needs to. They're not huge, but I'm sure you can see those, and you'll also see they're reflected in the frame rate, which oftentimes will spend a little too much time at around 24-25 frames per second, particularly as it loads in items, and then that will creep up. Now, when you're down in the streets fighting, that's probably where frame drop is going to be most evident. The reason for this isn't because it's worse in the streets, in actual fact it's slightly better, but it's because the combat relies so heavily on fluid motion. And let's be honest, the combat in this series is probably some of the best we've ever had regardless of genre. And when it's maintaining 30, that's just fine. It actually is really quite nice to control. But when it starts to stutter down or you see hitches, it can make timing those parries a little more tricky and a little more frustrating. Now on the streets or gliding through the air, I'd say is passable, generally 26 to 28 frames per second. Frame pacing gets really janky when you're trying to move quickly, which you'll do very often, but then they introduce the Batmobile. Now this obviously ups the speed, ups the number of items needed to be loaded into the world. You'll have other vehicles on the road, and I don't think it's unfair to say that in these moments it is bad on Switch. It looks terrible, the resolution drops right down. You can still control it, thankfully. Input latency seems to be quite low, which is one blessing. Perhaps they just switched off VSync altogether because it doesn't really hit that 30 consistently. But yeah, when you're chasing cars around or buzzing around the city in the Batmobile, doesn't quite do justice to that vehicle, I have to say, and certainly you can see the aliasing on the Batmobile itself. Now clearly the visual quality is not up to par and the frame rates definitely need some work, but it still goes to show what good art direction they've got here, that it actually sometimes looks okay. Yes, it's a dark game, but it uses light and shadow very well. Certain models look quite nice. Batman himself obviously has the most attention paid to him, and while he has some jaggy edges, he looks passable. Others don't hold up quite as well, but still compared to the environment itself they look better. It's when there's multiple on screen that their overall quality seems to drop right down. And something that was once a staple of the series and almost like a show-off moment were the slowdowns during combat. They lose their luster a little bit when the textures are as low as they are. In fairness to Arkham Knight, it is, as I say, the hardest to run out of all the games. Obviously, I have to be very critical when it comes to frame rates and things. As for whether I would actually recommend picking it up on Switch, well, your mileage may vary. We all have different sensitivities to these things. Harry Potter, I could kind of take, like I expected a certain level of quality drop, but what Harry Potter didn't suffer from were consistently 24-25 frames per second hitches and drops. That does make a big impact on your overall experience. I'm quite confident, as I'm sure you all are, that the reason we saw a delay in this is that they've worked longer on this version than the other two. But yeah, it's still not ideal. One area that has come across wonderfully is the sound. I forgot how good the sound is in these games. Being able to hear those thugs at street level chatting about how you once broke their arm, but the chances of lightning striking twice are minimal. They never cease to make me chuckle as you glide down and just dish out a bit of justice. So as I say, do make sure you're subscribed and have your notifications on. In the next day, you'll see the other videos popping up with all the information about the other games. Let me know in the comments if there's anything that I've missed. Hopefully not. A big thanks to our Patreons and members, and as always, for all things Switch all the time, keep it Switch up. Cheers guys. See ya!